So let us begin with the Romanov Empire. And I would call it Romanov Empire, not the Russian Empire, for a reason. And if you want to learn more about my views about these issues, you read a book in English, The Romanov Empire and Nationalism, Essays in Methodology of Historical Research, published in 2008 or 9, I don't remember. Let us first ask ourselves, when people who lived in this area, in Muscovy, let's say, became part of empire, when they became acquainted with empire.
Like the normal people, how?
Well, no, not with the concept, but in practice, I mean, in life. When this area becomes part of empire. Huh? 13th century, when the empire of Mongols comes to this area and turns this area into imperial periphery. People in this area have contacts with the Byzantine Empire, but they're not part of it. Here they are part of it, subordinated part. And this story is partly the story of how a peripheral political entity gradually transforms itself into imperial core. The official title of empire appears here, emperor and empire, in the early 18th century, and it comes together with the term naция, nation. And there was no, basically, any contradiction between them. What is interesting is that Peter, who proclaims himself an emperor, is probably the only one in a broadly understood Europe who did it by his own will. The term emperor is reserved for the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Other rulers are kings, and there is a difference. In Peter's empire, 80% of population are Orthodox Slavs. It's a very good proportion to claim it as a nation state, but nobody knows such a concept. And as Osterhammel reminds us, and you know Jürgen Osterhammel, right? And you know Die Verwandlung der Welt, the best book about global history written during the last 10 years, probably. He says that the 19th century is the century of empires and nationalism, but not the age of nation states. We shall come to it. So when we look at the Russian Empire, we have to understand that this polity grows for approximately 2.5 centuries with an average speed of 50 square miles, attention, per day. So 2.5 centuries plus 50 square miles per day, but I mean, it was big bites, and sometimes the bites which the empire couldn't properly chew. Of course, most of this growth comes across the Ural Mountains. Huge areas of Siberia, later Far East, not densely populated, and people who live there definitely do not know what is a nation, definitely do not know what is nationalism, and they don't challenge empire from this perspective. Nationalism in this area will be promoted by the Russians, who would claim that Russians in Siberia should be treated as white people in Australia, as a colony which has rights. But empire also grows to the west. And when you confront this fact that empire grows fast, you have to explain it. And the most simple explanation, which usually is sufficient for commentators of Russian political behavior, is that they are inherently imperialistic. However, it's a long period of time. It's various situations, various geopolitical constellations, and if we look at the growth of the Russian Empire to the west during the 18th and early 19th century, very often it is the consequence of defeat of their policy and not of success of their policy. First of all, we should look at the partitions of the Polish Commonwealth. The initial idea of the rulers of the Romanov Empire, so-called Panin system, Panin was what we call now the Minister of Foreign Affairs, was we keep Poland separate, independent, but weak. We block any attempt to strengthen the power of the king. We position ourselves as protectors of the rights of the dissidents, religious dissidents, and basically we rely on playing various parties among Schlachta against each other. And this Russian ambassador who sits in Warsaw on a huge sack of money to manipulate people against each other, ambassadors of Austria and Prussia, and they have their own designs. And they want partition. What I'm saying is not any attempt to say that Russians are any better than Prussians and Austrians. They want all Polish Commonwealth, but not as a part of their empire, as a satellite, as a domain which is controlled from St. Petersburg. And we have these partitions, which are, in certain sense, the defeat of Russian policy there. A similar story is the story with Sweden, where again, Panin system envisages keeping Sweden weak, but separate. And here they are confronted with French. And here, at the moment when Russian Empire was busy with the Ottomans, with Pugachev uprising, and with Polish partition, Swedes get away. They made coup d'etat and strengthened the power of the king, and this system of, how to put it, Brezhnev version of, Panin version of the future Brezhnev system disappears. And here, at the end of the 18th century, Russia got densely populated, pretty big territory, which transformed the empire dramatically in many ways. In the Russian Empire of the 18th century, there are no Jews. Simply, Jews are prohibited to settle in the Russian Empire. They have like 20, 25 Jews. I mean, you need doctors. But generally, no Jews. And after partitions, just like this, the Russian Empire becomes a country with not only the most numerous Jewish population in the world, but it's a home to half of the world Jewry, just like this. And they got Polish Szlachta. And Polish Szlachta is something very special because when we look at the 18th century, we can see how this empire pretty successfully incorporates, domesticates peripheral elites, be it the Cossack leadership on the left bank of the Dnieper, or be it Baltic German nobles. They are all loyal. They become gradually acculturated or even assimilated. Of course, Little Russians much faster than Germans, but Germans kept their loyalty till the very end of the empire, as well as Little Russians, by the way. Now, with Poles, it doesn't work for two reasons. One reason is that there are too many. When we look at Baltic German nobility, they constitute approximately between 1% and 2% of population. This is the same scheme like with the Russian nobility. This is nobility of the books. The Polish nobility actually use the term Szlachta just to differentiate, so that we don't end up thinking that Bürgertum is the same as middle class and so on and so forth. These are different social realities. And Szlachta is, of course, different than nobility because it constitutes like 10% of the population. And most of these people do not have any papers to confirm. And most of these people are so poor that basically economically they don't differ from peasants, but they differ in some other ways. They have right to have weapons, they are literate, and they don't want to pay taxes. They are not accustomed to do that. And when you get this group, which is approximately equal to the whole nobility of your empire numerically, what can you do? You cannot offer them jobs. You cannot offer them enough careers. And the other problematic thing is that these guys remember that they had their own state. Cossack Starshina didn't have their own state. They were fighting Poles, and they needed protector, and this protection comes from the Russian Tsar. They have tried all other options. It didn't work. Germans in the Baltic provinces are subject to the Swedish crown, and they are not happy with their situation with the Swedish crown because Swedes want to abolish certain feudal privileges. And the Russian Empire usually starts negotiations with saying, you are going to keep all your privileges if you are loyal. And this all happens at the end of the 18th century. And the end of the 18th century is the time when the concept nation, modern concept of the nation, comes into being. There is a concept nation before. In the 18th century, in this area, it means the noble corporation. So they will speak about Natio Hungarica, they will speak about Gente Rutenus, Natione Polonus. And there are some people in Russia in the 18th century who write various projects of reforms using the term nation to describe the corporation of Russian imperial nobility. But the concept of nation, which is the source of all political legitimacy, comes with French Revolution. So it is Abbé de Sieyès who says that it's nation who gives political legitimacy. It's nation who is the only source of legal norms. And who is nation for the leaders of French Revolution?
Third estate?
Exactly. So when we say third estate, that means not the first and not the second one. Who is the first estate?
Aristocracy. The other one, okay, the religious.
First estate is clergy, second estate is nobility, out. So you have to remember that concept nation, how it is shaped in the end of the 18th century and how it functions until today is not only about inclusion, but it is also very much about exclusion. Not only just a second, based on racial terms, on gender terms. There were good times when women were the property of the nation, but not participants in the nation.
Sorry, just because I think it's interesting what you just said, because actually nowadays the concept of nation has this exclusive.
Of course it has.
You said back then it was more exclusive, or it has this exclusive aspect, but I would rather say that in its initial period it had a more inclusive and democratic character than it has now. I mean, it was basically...
I disagree.
Yeah?
I disagree. Exclusion was very, very pronounced, not only by kicking out this aristocracy, etc., but consider sans-culottes. And we are also nation. Really? Do you see a cannon at the end of this street? So repeat, you are a nation. It happened. What is the beginning of career of Napoleon? He started to use cannons in the streets of the city. And then what is Paris in 1848? What is Paris in 1830? It's about how National Guard suppresses those people who want to be part of the nation and who are knocking from below. But of course, there is an opening. So if you knock long enough and in a proper way, you can make it into like in British system. So democracy, nation is about gradual inclusion, but this process is really very gradual. So to make long story short, it's approximately the first 30 years of the 19th century when Russian Empire encounters the same problem as many other, practically all other big political entities of Europe. It becomes a nationalizing empire. If you want to learn more about what it all means, you read a book under the title Nationalizing Empires, which I edited together with my German friend Stefan Berger. This book was published in 2015, and it argues that all the concepts of nationalism, which we know, which come from Gellner, etc., they basically describe peripheral nationalisms. And Osterhammel also speaks mostly about peripheral nationalisms. But when we think about big European nations, these nations are built in the core of empire and by empires. Spain, French, British, Russian. Germans are different in the sense that the order of things was changed as soon as they constructed what is referred to as a nation state, and which was by reason called Reich. They embark on imperialism. They embark on imperialism overseas, and later they embark on imperialism in Eastern Europe, and so on and so forth. Italians, who are always a joke about state, they also use imperial idea during the period of Risorgimento, this irredentist period, right? And as soon as, and when they build what they call a nation state, they appeal to virtues of Romanità, so the virtues of the Roman Empire, and then they immediately start imperial expansion in Africa, etc., etc. So scenarios can be different. In Spanish case, nation building in Iberian Peninsula takes place in the context of basically shrinking of the empire. In Russian case, we have growing empire. In some cases, it is a maritime empire, mostly maritime. But, okay, what is Britain? Is it just a maritime empire? What about Scotland? What about Wales? What about Ireland? Look at France. There is a very good book, Peasants into Frenchmen, written by Eugene Weber, not Max. That is about French long effort to Frenchify the population of what is now presented as natural French space. Approximately 1/3 of inhabitants of France didn't speak French by the end of the 19th century. Now, in Russian case, gradually, they came to idea that also partly when they were looking at unification of Germany, but also when they were looking at France and Britain, that you need a big nation in the imperial core. It is linked to army, of course, which is the most important thing in empire. Instead of recruitment, you have conscription, and what is important here, that we have two books which try to address this issue. One is Andreas Kepler, the Russian Empire as Vielvölkerreich, right? It was written in late 80s, and it tells you a lot about various peripheral communities, ethno-religious communities, but there is a small hole in the middle. He practically has nothing to say about Russians. As an immediate reaction to this, you have 6 years later the book by Jeffrey Hosking, Russia, People and Empire. And Jeffrey Hosking argues that empire is something which blocked the formation of the Russian nation. And basically, if you follow his reasoning up to, so to say, absurdum, but it has been done. I mean, people have written this. Russians had two options. One option was to transform the whole empire into a nation state, and the other was to get rid of the empire and just stay with Russians and become a nation state. Now, it's all absolutely ridiculous because practically there were no such idiots among Russians who believed that they could make good Russians out of Poles. So basically, the most aggressive projects of Russification, which come from Russian revolutionaries, Decembrists. They argue that all the tribes should be melted in one nation, except Poles. But all these tribes should be melted into one nation gradually. But these guys were radicals. I mean, Pestel, who wrote this Russkaya Pravda, the Russian law, this 1823, and then he was hanged in 1825. And if he won, his plan was to kill the whole Tsar's family. Only Bolsheviks could manage this task, to abolish serfdom, and to eliminate all the, this is interesting because it will reemerge later, to eliminate all the differences in the names of Russian tribes. So Great Russians, Little Russians, White Russians, they should all be called Russians. And this is the beginning of a long story of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, when the concept of the Russian nation is based on this idea of the unity of Orthodox Eastern Slavs. Little Russians, White Russians, Great Russians. Yes?
I'm not really familiar with the terms Little Russians, White Russians.
Little Russians, Maloros, was a term, well, it is very dangerous to say that is how we call, these are people whom we call today Ukrainians. It's not true, in the sense that these terms reflect differences in identity formation. People who called themselves Malorossi believed that they are, how to put it, together with Velikorossi, part of some common Russian entity.
Why would they call themselves?
Eh?
Why would they call themselves like that?
This term, Little Russia, Malorossia, is pretty old. It comes from a religious language. Russia Minor means the original Rus.
It's like from Kiev.
So it is, yes, it is not Velikorossi, big Russians, important Russians, Malorossi, small Russians. That is what a stupid sort of Ukrainian nationalist today would teach kids at school. The same is in Poland, where you have Malopolska and Wielkopolska. Malopolska with Krakow is the original Poland. Greater Poland is the extension. So Great Russia is the extension of Little Russia. It's not hierarchy. Now, that means that in the Russian Empire, Russian nationalism, which informs the action of a part of imperial bureaucracy, but also Russian nationalism as the movement from below. They all have a distinction between the space of empire and the image of national territory. And when empire grows, national territory will also grow. It's not, how to put it, strictly dependent processes. In the 19th century, Siberia is not perceived as part of Russian national territory. It becomes Russian national territory mostly, in terms of imagined geography, in terms of discourse, narrative, etc., and general perception. In the late 19th, early 20th century. And it is linked to a very important part of this history. Russian imperial history is very much a history of massive agricultural migrations. And there are 4 regions where this migration is concentrated. One is the New Russia, the area conquered from the Ottomans, with such areas as, with such cities as, today it is called Dnipro, and it was Yekaterinoslav, Odessa. Then Northern Caucasus, where Adigs are kicked out by the Cossacks. And Stavropol becomes a Russian gubernia in the middle of the 19th century. It was the part of viceroyalty of Caucasus before. And one more is Volga region, where influx of Russian population transforms the region into a region where Russians dominate. We can speak about demographic occupation and also assimilation processes. And here you will find, how to put it, discrepancy in Russian nationalist discourse. In Western borderlands, Russian nationalist discourse insists that all Eastern Slavs are Russians, and if there are differences, these differences come from the bad influence of the Poles. Under the rule of Poles, these people lived for many centuries. And Poles, of course, construct their own discourse, which says that we are Slavs, you are Slavs, and these guys from Moscow are not Slavs, they are Turanians, and so on. In Volga region, this Russian nationalist discourse would say that we are complementary with Finno-Ugric people. It's very fine if Russian peasants marry Ugro-Finnic people, etc., etc. It's the same nation. This lack of consistency is typical for any nationalism, including German. When German nationalism was claiming people of Alsace, they were saying these are good Germans spoiled by French rule. When they were speaking about Masurians, they were saying, well, they are not originally German, but they're Protestants, unlike Poles. They love Kaiser. Teach them German and you can make them good Germans. And partly they managed by the 20th century. So lack of consistency is a very typical feature for such discourses. Now, in Russian case, we can say that the First World War comes at the moment when all those processes, which were extremely important for success of nation building, of big nations, were just starting to work. You have economic growth of approximately 6.5% per year. It's like China. You have transformation of agriculture. You have dramatic growth of urbanization. You have the rise of Donetsk coal mining and iron production. And this is the period when basically these assimilationist processes work. In what we know now as Ukraine, there is only one city which has the majority of Ukrainian speakers, Poltava, 52%. In all other Ukrainian cities in the Russian Empire, the majority speaks Russian. Note that these are not guys who come from Great Russia. These are local people who adopt Russian as their language of everyday use. You have this typical situation that people in city speak Russian, people in village speak Little Russian, or if you wish, Ukrainian, because at that time the term Ukrainian as the name for a separate nation is coined and is used. You have Ukrainian nationalism. Now, a long story is the story of the war. There are two books which you can consult. One is about Russia in the First World War, edited by Vera Tolz, T-O-L-Z, and Eric Lohr, L-O-H-R. And the other book published by Austrians, Wolfram Dornick, edited a big volume about Ukrainian lands in the First World War and the Revolution. A good one. Now, then we come to the Soviet system. First question, who were the enemies of the Bolsheviks in the Civil War? On a very
the whites,
the whites. Who were the whites?
the former Tsarist elites, and the remains of the Tsarist army and aristocracy.
You cannot fight a civil war for 3 years just with aristocracy. The
Mensheviki, they were a very heterogene group. It was not just one group, but
So,
there were many.
Whites are very heterogeneous group, but what unites them all is the fact that they are all Russian nationalists. So you have to understand that this is the conflict in which Bolsheviks saw social groups who are the bearers of these previous imperial Russian nationalists as their main enemies: clergy, nobility, rich town dwellers, and when we say that they saw them as the enemies, and Cossacks, for example, when we saw that they saw them as enemies, that means something in practical terms. There was a Kiev club of Russian nationalists which used to win elections to State Duma in Kiev. And when Bolsheviks come to Kiev, they captured the archive. And within 3 days, they have arrested all the members of the club whom they found in Kiev. And they killed all these people immediately. So when we talk about revolution, civil war, etc., it is to to a very large extent, the destruction of social basis of the previous Russian nationalism. The policy which the Soviet state pursues in the interwar period is the policy of Korenizatsiya, indigenization, which is an absolutely conscious and systematic dismantling, deconstruction of all the achievements of the building of the big Russian nation in the Russian Empire. The principle of how this system functioned was described very accurately by Terry Martin in his book, The Affirmative Action Empire. I'm very much impressed by the fact that you are putting all these names into your notes, which means that you are not familiar with them. It's a big achievement of your teachers. There is another book which confronts Martin, insisting that there is more continuity than rupture, written by Francine Hirsch. She is also an American scholar, The Empire of Nations. This is nonsense. No, it makes sense to read because her dissertation, which was written about the transfer of some ideas and some knowledge and some barriers of professional knowledge from the Tsarist Empire into the Soviet setting, was good. But when she was preparing her book, her dissertation for publication, probably the editor said, but you are writing the book on a topic which is now dominated by Martin. He published his book 3 years before and it became bestseller. So argue with Martin. And she has an introduction which is total nonsense. Okay. So, the leaders of this agricultural migrations and settlement and demographic occupation, Cossacks, are now the enemies of the Soviet power as a state. The bearers of this idea of Russian nationalism, also in most ugly forms, who are able to reach peasants, I mean clergy, are now kicked out of the game. And the very central idea, which is the unity in one nation of Little Russian, Great Russian, and White Russian people, is transformed into the idea of the brotherhood of three independent nations: Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Yes?
Is it only three nations? Doesn't it include the Caucasus states, like the Central Asian state, or is it still something else?
No. Gradually, everybody becomes a brother nation. But this idea that these nations have special connection to the Russians is there. It's tricky, we don't have time to discuss it, but it is very clear that what is called Korenizatsiya in Ukrainian case is Ukrainization. And Ukrainization, among other things, is, for example, liquidation of illiteracy in Ukrainian. Now, the question is, why in Ukrainian?
You mean Ukrainian language?
Yes, why in Ukrainian language Bolsheviks conduct liquidation of illiteracy in Ukraine?
Maybe to build a sense of Ukrainian nationalism in order, I mean, isn't it the idea that first of all you have to become a nation and then at a higher stage the nation can kind of dissolve?
Yeah, it's part of the story. But, okay, how it is easier in practical terms to do it in Russian or in Ukrainian, liquidation of illiteracy.
In the local language.
Huh?
In the local language.
What the problem is that Ukrainian language, which is a literary language, is not the local language. It is a cultural construct together with a Russian language. I mean, the local people, peasants, speak a dialect, vernacular of sorts. The question is, how many teachers can you recruit to teach in Russian or in Ukrainian? And it is very clear that Russian teachers is much easier available. Then you have a problem that town dwellers, including proletariat, and proletariat should not be treated badly. They do not like the idea that they should be now taught in Ukrainian. And you have tensions, and you have scandals. Ukrainian nationalism, you might say that it is bowing to Ukrainian nationalism, which became rather strong during the First World War and the Revolution. A tricky situation, because what a Bolshevik, a good Bolshevik, would do if he meets a Ukrainian nationalist from the rank of Petlura movement. He is looking for a tree to hang him. So bowing to Ukrainian nationalism was not exactly on the program of the Bolsheviks. It was appropriating, stealing, and controlling the idea of Ukrainian nation. But anyway, we are dealing with a situation in which the basis, the very ground idea of the whole nationality policy is that we shouldn't have minorities. The solution for minority issue is to carve for them a separate entity. In the Soviet Union, we had 10,000 autonomous regions, kolkhoz, okrug, republics, autonomous republics, and then Soviet socialist republics. Every national group was supposed to have their own territory where they were the masters.
It's based in the Marxist theory, in the socialist
Forget Marxist theory. It's not about Marxist theory.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to know. I mean, because you can say you have the idea of self-determination of people that kind of is also prominent in Marxism, that kind of made it in Lenin's theory. And I was wondering if you think it has more pragmatic political reasons?
Okay, it's a good question because it allows me to go back to the point which, very important point, which I missed. So when we look at the end of the First World War, which is, of course, a transformative experience, the idea that the First World War brings a collapse of these empires, including the German Empire, Habsburg Empire, Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire, because all these empires are, so to say, outdated, is the product of the 20th century historiography, which is legitimizing nation state. Nation state was not perceived as a norm. Read a text which is very short and you know about its existence. The 14 Points by Woodrow Wilson. You know. Okay, if you know the existence or you know the text itself. Read this text. He speaks about the Russian Empire. He speaks about the Ottoman Empire. He speaks about the Habsburg Empire. Meaning that all these polities are going to survive. he speaks about more autonomy for the nations in these polities, but not about the solution of these empires. And just in point 13, he shows that he knows a different language when he says Poland becomes an independent nation. He knows how to pronounce these words, but Poland is an exception for him. So the idea of self-determination is promoted in the context of the First World War by three actors. Woodrow Wilson, and for him self-determination does not mean nation state. It means political autonomy. Lenin, who looks at it as an instrument of world revolution. And Germans, who promote the idea of self-determination of the small people of the Russian Empire, small peoples, as a reasonable tactic of supporting separatist movements in the camp of your enemy. So the strength of national movements at the end of the war very much depends on the resources which were pumped into these movements by the rival empires. But of course, Germans promoting self-determination of Ukrainians, Belarusians, etc., didn't mean independent nation state. Friedrich Naumann in Mitteleuropa, when it was published, guys, are you Germans? Who is Friedrich Naumann? What is Mitteleuropa? It is a concept of how Germany is going to dominate Eastern Europe after the victory in the First World War. It was published as a book in 1915. So it was, of course, about this new imperial order, but not about the world of the nation states. So in this respect, we can see that Soviet expansionism, if you wish, imperialism, is different from the Russian one, because it promotes the idea of revolution and socialist order. It is based on this playing with the national independence principle. So when Soviets are preparing to conquer Poland, for example, they shape a Polish government from among the Bolsheviks they have. When they try to do it with Finland, they also have enough Finns to have a government, etc., etc. It's a different sort of imperialism. And of course, Soviet Union would be extremely angry if they were called empire, like today's Americans. We are not empire, right? But empire evolves, empire changes. Empire is with us and is going to be with us. And the European Union is also a sort of empire. Read Zielonka. You know this Polish name, but he's a guy from Cambridge. He wrote a book about the European Union as an empire, looking for similarities with the Holy Roman Empire. The European Union as empire, something like this. Z-I-E-L, Zielonka. here we come to a very important point. In a normative liberal discourse, which is dying in our eyes, which is interesting and nice, empire is a bad thing. Empire, if it functions properly, is, well, the thing with which you can live. If a nation state functions properly, stay with the nation state. That brings me to the crucial point for today's Russia. The idea that Russia will reach normality when it becomes a nation state. And they argue that, okay, 80% of population are Russians, why not a nation state? So my point is, first of all, there is no nation state in Russia, and nation state is impossible in Russia.
At the time or also now?
Now, we are talking about today's Russia now. And now my answer, why? Because we live on the ruins of two empires. Let us begin with the ruins of the Soviet Empire. Soviet Empire is built on the principle of territorialization and institutionalization of ethnicity. It all begins, for example, in the census of 1926, when people who do this census forbid people on the ground the term Maloros, Little Russian, as identification. So people who do the census are instructed that if somebody tells you that he is Little Russian, explain him that he is Ukrainian. We have, what is nation state? Nation state is a state in which a certain group politically mobilized as a nation believes that they are the owners of this state. Usually such a state has minorities. These minorities can be treated nicely, or they can be treated very badly. Germans have experience of both. But the idea that it is German state and the property of the Germans is very much there. You do not expect Turks living in Germany to claim territorial autonomy, except Kreuzberg. Alternatively, you may have two or more politically mobilized groups as nations who believe that they have certain territory as their national property. In the contemporary Russian Federation, you have 21 autonomous republics inherited from the Soviet Union. So, to build a nation state, you have to explain Tatars that they are not a nation. It is pretty difficult, believe me.
So just to understand, so you would consider these, because you said a normal nation state can have many minority groups.
But not the groups who claim that a certain area is their nation state, with their president, and so on and so forth. Which does not mean that it's a unique situation. In certain sense, we have this situation. For example, in Canada, where we have Quebec. In Belgium, it doesn't mean that this state nation, read Stepan and Linz. Alfred Stepan, Juan Linz, they wrote a book about comparison and distinction between nation state and state nation. as two models. Stepan, simple. Linz, also simple. Z is the last. So, you can also read Rogers Brubaker about nationalizing states of Germany, France, etc., because nationalizing state and nation state are a bit different things. Why I'm saying all this? Because ruins are not an empty space. You have probably seen the ruins of Colosseum. Try to build a swimming pool there. It's difficult. Ruins, either you dismantle them or you learn to live with them. You adapt them to new realities. You can follow the attempts to gradually dismantle these national units. And it is tricky because they came close, for example, to a referendum about in Adygea Republic to join Krasnodar Krai. In Adygea, 65% of population are the Russians. All the bureaucracy is Adig. It's the name of the Caucasian group of people. Some of them are called Cherkess, not Chechens, different. Now, when you have Adigs who believe that Adygea is their national property, and you have them as a minority in their own republic, of course you can vote in a referendum that no Adygea anymore. But then you face a reaction from pretty numerous Adig diaspora who lives outside of Russia. And you might end up in a very dramatic and unhealthy situation. So it's very complicated. Now, as I said, also the ruins of the Romanov Empire, of the Russian Empire. Where we see them? We see them in the mines. Solzhenitsyn, whose centennial we have just marked several days ago, in 1990 publishes a text under the title "Как нам обустроить Россию?" How should we reorganize Russia? What he says there, he says, Baltic republics want to live. A pity, but let them live. Central Asian republics do not want to live. Kick them out. Caucasian republics do not want to live. Kick them out. Who should stay? Russia without Chechnya. Ukraine without Western Ukraine. Belarus and Northern Kazakhstan. When you look at this space and the map, you will see that it is almost exactly the image of Russian national territory in the late Romanov Empire. So this image re-emerges after decades of non-existence. Now we come to a very important document, which you should read because it is available in English. It is Putin's speech in this event of including Crimea into the Russian Federation, 2014. And he explains why it's being done how to put it, the reasons and justifications. So, what are the reasons he provides? What are justifications he provides? Geopolitical, one. If we don't control Crimea, it is being controlled by our enemies. Our Black Sea fleet is homeless, etc., etc. We cannot imagine NATO ships in Sevastopol. We are not talking about how much sense it makes. It's just the geopolitical argument. Then a democratic argument. People of Crimea voted in referendum for joining Russia. Again, you can discuss about how fair was this referendum. I can assure you that indeed the majority voted freely for that. But it doesn't matter. And then comes the third argument. Irredentist. These are Russian people. We cannot leave them in danger when radical nationalists seize power in Kiev. Here we come to a very important point. Irredentism is
How do you say it?
irredentism. I-double-R. The irredenta is a concept which was used by Italian nationalists in the 19th century when they were claiming that Italy should be united. It is also used to describe German unification, not in the 20th century, but in the 19th century. In the 20th century, in the 21st century, irredentism is a part of ideology of many countries. It was part of German official ideology. Germany was not recognizing two Germanies. I mean, technically they were recognizing, but it was always the idea that these two Germanies should unite, which is irredentism. It is part of ideology of China. All the parts of China which were taken away from China by imperialists. Hong Kong, Macau, they did it already. Taiwan, pretty complicated. If the Third War begins, it begins there. Hopefully between Americans and Chinese only. But when Moscow says that there is one state which unites Russia and Belarus, it's irredentism. But Moscow says, okay, make a referendum. If you want to join, you join. Some irredentist concepts are not necessarily immediately triggering attention in the war. But if you use irredentist idea towards Ukraine, or towards Kazakhstan, or towards Estonia, it's casus belli simply because you claim not the whole state but part of a territory. This discourse of Russians being the biggest divided nation in Europe is pretty popular here. If we say that there is a potential for an ideology which can be challenge to the ruling regime today, it is a nationalist ideology. And it is very dangerous. So what Putin did, among other things, during the annexation of Crimea in 2014, he captured the nationalist agenda. If we want to understand behavior in 2013, 2014, we have to look, the story begins in 2011, when you have the growing protest movement, which combines two ideas: that elections are being stolen, and the second idea that the elite is corrupted in a sense that they keep their wives, kids, girlfriends, pets, doctors, dachas, etc., money, etc., in the West. And by doing that, they simply cannot oppose the West when it encroaches on vital Russian interests. And Ukraine is, of course, extremely important. And in 2013, European Union wants to take Ukraine from the process of building the customs union out. And when Putin says, we also want to participate in these elections, in these negotiations, he's being told, it's not your business, it's bilateral relations between European Union and Ukraine. And if he accepts this situation, then in the country he faces a very simple question. Okay, you have lost Ukraine, you have lost everything, so Navalny is right saying that you are just pets of the West. You can imagine. In my view, the very fact that after this speech he never used the irredentist argument again is very nice thing. So here we can say that Russia should start behaving herself like Germany, in a sense that it should create proper conditions for those Russians who want to move to Russia from neighboring republics. But here comes a big, big challenge, because when Germans were doing that, they were basically facing the situation when they have lost everything. Right? They have lost the war. Germans were kicked out from everywhere, including Holland, not just Czechs, who are very calm when it comes to occupation and very brutal when it comes to liberation. But generally, Germans were just then taking small groups of Germans from Kazakhstan or from Russia, in the discourse of saving them. Here we have 20 million Russians living abroad. And the idea that, are we really prepared to recognize, for example, the claim of the Latvians that having 40% of Russian population there, they treat Latvia as their national property, meaning ethnic property. Are we prepared to take these people out of Crimea, or are we going to take Crimea with these people? It's tricky. In the situation when all the positive agenda between Russia and European Union is gone, except pipeline, which is also going to go away probably soon. We'll see. Why there is a chance for that, and why I'm extremely pessimistic about Russian-European relations. Europe is in crisis as European Union. Europe is in crisis. It has a problem of building a unity, solidarity, etc., etc. It is challenged by many things, including refugees, etc., but not only. When you are in crisis about solidarity and unity, what do you need? You need a constitutive other. You need an enemy. Who can play such a role for Europe? Guys, we are the only option. Now Trump is doing his best, but you are not brave enough to recognize that, but I mean, I don't see any realistic chance for improvement of relations in a foreseeable future. Interesting thing, and this is the last thing which I am going to tell you, unless you have some questions at the end, is that we are now living in Russia through a very interesting and important moment. Russian identity, particularly among educated stratas, was built around the idea of Europeanness of Russia. So Russian debates about the future were all the time concentrated about the question how we join Europe in one way or another, how we become like Europe, how we westernize ourselves, etc., etc. At a certain point, when people in Russia, some of them, realized that basically Russia is fixed in her role of eternal apprentice, she will never be accepted to the guild. They formulated the idea of Russia and Europe as enemies. Danilevsky wrote a book about Europe, Россия и Европа, Russia and Europe, about two civilizational entities, separate and enemies. Today, Russians, for the first time in many, many years, started to think about their future without focusing on Europe, which is a very nice idea. They think about China, they think about Asia, they think about many things, and they do not focus exclusively on Europe. And this funny idea of Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok does not paralyze their minds anymore, which is a very good thing.